But if I told you that for many men, sex isn't just about physical release, but about feeling truly loved, accepted, and emotionally safe, that behind every sexual advance, there's often a silent question being asked: do you still want me? Do I still matter to you? We often talk about intimacy as something emotional for women and physical for men, but what if that belief is missing the point and silently tearing couples apart without them even realizing it? Contrary to the stereotype that men seek sex purely for physical gratification, the truth is far more nuanced and emotionally complex. For many men, sex represents one of the most vulnerable and meaningful forms of emotional connection they experience in a relationship. It is often through physical intimacy that they feel safe enough to let their guard down, to express tenderness, affection, and the deeper layers of their emotional world that may not come easily through words. Men are not typically socialized to communicate their emotions openly. From a young age, many are taught to be strong, stoic, and self-reliant. As a result, emotional vulnerability can feel unfamiliar or even threatening. Yet during moments of sexual intimacy, something shifts. Walls come down, and for a brief window, many men access and express their softer, more emotionally rich side. In these moments, sex becomes a silent language through which they say, "I love you," "I need you," or even, "I'm struggling," without ever needing to speak those words aloud. It's not simply about desire, it's about closeness, reassurance, and a sense of belonging. When a man feels desired by his partner, it touches something deep in his core. It tells him he is accepted, valued, and wanted, not just for what he does, but for who he is. This kind of validation is not superficial. It cuts to the heart of masculine identity, particularly in the context of a committed relationship. It becomes a powerful source of emotional grounding. In fact, for many men, consistent sexual intimacy can be the bridge to greater emotional vulnerability and openness in the rest of the relationship. It is not uncommon for a man to begin expressing deeper emotions or engaging in more meaningful conversations after feeling connected through sex, because it is in that state of closeness that he feels emotionally safe. This dynamic often goes unnoticed or misunderstood, particularly in relationships where communication styles differ. While some partners may be looking for verbal affirmations or acts of service as proof of love, men may be quietly longing for intimacy as their way of feeling emotionally nourished. And when that need is misunderstood or minimized, it can create a gap in the relationship where emotional connection feels one-sided or incomplete. Recognizing that sex is emotional for men too isn't about excusing bad behavior or prioritizing physical needs above all else. It's about seeing the full emotional context behind a man's desire for intimacy. When partners begin to understand that sex, for many men, is a primary channel for expressing love and emotional vulnerability, it becomes easier to connect on a deeper level. Rather than seeing physical intimacy as separate from emotional closeness, we begin to realize that for many men the two are inseparably linked, and that connection, when nurtured, can transform the entire dynamic of a marriage. For many men, sexual intimacy isn't just about pleasure. It is one of the most powerful forms of emotional validation they experience in a relationship, acting as a core affirmation of their worth, attractiveness, and value as a partner. When a man is desired sexually by the person he loves, it sends a direct, visceral message to him that he is still wanted, still appreciated, and still important. In a world where men are often measured by their output, how much they provide, how strong they appear, how capable they are, sex becomes one of the few areas where they feel truly seen for who they are, not just what they do. It's a space where ego, emotion, and vulnerability collide in a deeply personal way. When a partner initiates intimacy or responds positively to a man's desire, it's interpreted by him as a loud, unspoken yes to his presence, to his masculinity, and to his emotional place in her life. That sense of being wanted taps into a very primal need. one that doesn't go away with time, even in long-term relationships. Over time, as familiarity and routines settle into a marriage, men often worry silently about whether they are still attractive, still enough, still cherished. They may not voice these insecurities directly, but they carry them in small, quiet moments of self-doubt. Sexual rejection, especially when it happens repeatedly or without explanation, doesn't just feel like a physical no, it feels like a personal one, a denial of affection, importance, and emotional relevance. This is why a man may feel especially hurt or withdrawn when intimacy fades in a relationship, even if everything else seems fine on the surface. He may not know how to explain it or even fully understand it himself. But the lack of physical closeness leaves him feeling emotionally disconnected, sometimes even invisible. On the other hand, when his partner expresses desire toward him, whether through touch, compliments, or sexual engagement, it fills a deep emotional need that words alone often can't satisfy. It reassures him that he is still loved and desired, and that the connection between them is still alive. This form of validation isn't about ego in a shallow sense, it's about emotional security, about knowing that he matters, not just as a provider, not just as a father or a husband in title, but as a man who is still passionately chosen. For men who struggle to verbalize emotional needs, physical intimacy becomes the clearest and most honest affirmation of their place in their partner's heart. It becomes the language through which they interpret love and acceptance. When a woman responds with warmth and receptivity in this area, it reinforces the bond in a way that strengthens trust, loyalty, and emotional openness. Without that kind of affirmation, many men begin to emotionally withdraw, even if they stay physically present in the relationship, leading to distance that can feel confusing or unexplainable to their partners. Men often express their emotions through action rather than words, and this fundamental difference in communication style can lead to misunderstandings in relationships if not fully understood or acknowledged. From a young age, many boys are socialized to suppress overt displays of emotion and to avoid verbal vulnerability, often being praised for stoicism, independence, and control rather than emotional openness. As they grow into adulthood, this conditioning doesn't simply disappear. Instead, it shapes the way they connect with others, especially in intimate relationships. While women are often more comfortable expressing love, concern, and vulnerability through conversation, men frequently do so through what they do, protecting, providing, showing up consistently, and especially through physical closeness. Sexual intimacy in this context becomes a primary way for many men to express their emotional connection and love. It's not just about lust or release, it's how they feel bonded, how they show affection, and how they experience emotional depth in the relationship. When a man reaches for his partner physically, he is often reaching emotionally too, even if he doesn't know how to verbalize that need. Through touch, he communicates what he might struggle to say with words, that he misses her, that he wants to be close, that he values their connection. These gestures, whether it's holding hands, cuddling, or engaging in sex, are rarely just physical acts in isolation. They are expressions of care, love, and a desire for emotional unity. When these actions are rejected or minimized, it can leave a man feeling confused and emotionally shut out. Not because he's needy in the traditional sense, but because one of his few ways of expressing affection has been blocked. Without a strong vocabulary for emotional dialogue, many men default to physical presence and touch as their emotional language. And when that is misunderstood, they often feel emotionally isolated, even if everything else in the relationship appears functional. On the flip side, when a partner understands that these physical gestures are emotionally loaded, it opens the door to a deeper level of intimacy and connection. It helps both partners bridge the gap between action and language, creating a relationship where both emotional styles are valued and validated. Recognizing that a man's approach to love often comes through what he does, whether through acts of service, sexual intimacy, or quiet consistency, allows for a richer understanding of his emotional world. He may not always articulate his feelings in long conversations, but his actions, especially physical ones, speak volumes. If these gestures are met with warmth and understanding, they serve to strengthen the emotional bond and foster trust. But if they're consistently dismissed or misinterpreted as mere physical impulses, a key emotional connection is lost, often without either partner fully realizing why the distance is growing. This difference in emotional expression isn't a flaw. It's simply a different way of connecting that, when acknowledged and respected, can deepen love in profound and lasting ways. When a man experiences repeated sexual rejection in a relationship, it often goes far deeper than just frustration over unmet physical needs. It can feel like emotional abandonment, a silent message that he is no longer desired, wanted, or emotionally connected to his partner. For many men, sexual intimacy is not just a biological urge, but a core way they experience love and closeness. And when that avenue is closed off, it doesn't register simply as a denied physical experience. It hits them emotionally, sometimes even existentially. Unlike how society often portrays men as being emotionally detached or primarily driven by lust, the reality is that for many men, consistent sexual rejection feels like being pushed away at the deepest level. It signals, rightly or wrongly, that something is wrong not just with the relationship but possibly with themselves. They may begin to question their attractiveness, their value, their worthiness as a partner, and even their role in the marriage. But because most men are not conditioned to openly express these feelings, especially when they stem from sexual vulnerability, the pain is often internalized, buried under silence or masked with withdrawal, irritability, or detachment. Instead of saying, "I feel unloved," or "I'm scared we're drifting apart," a man may simply retreat emotionally, believing there is no safe or acceptable way to express how deeply the lack of intimacy is affecting him. In long-term relationships, this dynamic can become even more pronounced, especially when other forms of connection, like verbal affirmation, appreciation, or physical affection, are also limited. Over time, the repeated experience of being turned away creates a kind of emotional scar tissue, where a man no longer feels safe reaching out and instead begins to distance himself to avoid further hurt. And the tragic part is, this often happens without the other partner realizing the emotional weight that intimacy carries for him. Many women, understandably, may interpret sexual advances as purely physical and may reject them without realizing the emotional message that was behind them. When this happens regularly, it can reinforce a pattern where both partners feel unappreciated and misunderstood, the man feels rejected and disconnected, and the woman feels pressured or emotionally distant, not realizing that what's really missing is a shared understanding of how each expresses and receives love. In this cycle, rejection becomes more than a temporary no. It starts to chip away at the foundation of emotional trust, and for a man who may already struggle with finding words for his deeper emotional needs, that kind of erosion can lead to feelings of shame, loneliness, or quiet resentment. It becomes harder to speak up, harder to be vulnerable, and much harder to reignite the emotional flame that once came so naturally. In this state, even when sex does happen, it may feel empty or disconnected because the emotional bridge that once linked intimacy and love has weakened. What's truly being rejected in those moments, in his eyes, isn't just the physical act. It's his need to feel close, valued, and emotionally safe. For many men, emotional openness does not come before intimacy, it is often the result of it, meaning that sexual connection becomes the doorway through which they access and express deeper emotional vulnerability. This runs contrary to the way emotional bonding is usually described or expected in relationships, where verbal sharing, quality time, and emotional conversations are seen as the precursors to physical closeness. But for a significant number of men, the order is reversed, not because they are emotionally shallow or emotionally unavailable, but because they are conditioned to access their emotions differently. Men are frequently taught from a young age to suppress their feelings, to power through discomfort, and to solve rather than share. As a result, they may not feel safe or skilled in expressing emotional vulnerability through words, especially when it comes to sensitive topics like fear, insecurity, sadness, or longing. However, when they engage in sexual intimacy with someone they love and trust, something shifts inside of them. In that space of physical closeness where they feel accepted, desired, and emotionally safe, they often open up in ways that would be nearly impossible for them outside of that context. The act of sex becomes a physical and emotional reset. It lowers their defenses, relaxes the mental walls they've built, and allows them to access a more open, unguarded version of themselves. It's not uncommon for men to share their deepest thoughts, worries, or confessions after moments of intimacy. Not because the sex made them emotional, but because the emotional safety created by the act allowed those feelings to surface. For men, sex isn't just a result of emotional connection, it is often the trigger that creates it. This is crucial for partners to understand, especially in marriages where emotional closeness has begun to feel one-sided or difficult to reach. While women might wait for emotional connection to build before they feel ready for intimacy, men often need the intimacy first to feel emotionally connected and safe enough to open up. This difference can lead to painful miscommunication and unmet needs where both partners are craving the same thing, closeness, but are trying to access it from different doors. When a man feels emotionally disconnected, his desire for sex often increases, not simply as a need for physical gratification, but as a longing for reconnection, a silent plea to bridge the emotional distance. And when that need is met with rejection or misunderstanding, it reinforces the emotional isolation he already feels, pushing him further into silence. Conversely, when a partner recognizes this emotional pathway and meets him there, even occasionally, it creates a powerful feedback loop where the man feels more emotionally supported, seen, and safe. In turn, he becomes more emotionally present, communicative, and responsive, not because he's being pushed to change, but because he feels secure enough to show up more fully. It's not that sex is a shortcut to emotional depth for men, it's that it unlocks a version of emotional presence that they may struggle to access otherwise. And when this pattern is acknowledged, respected, and nurtured, it can lead to a dynamic in the relationship where both partners feel deeply connected, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Instead of viewing intimacy as something that should follow emotional connection, it helps to recognize that for men it is often the very thing that creates it. Understanding this doesn't mean dismissing a partner's needs for emotional safety before sex, but it does mean honoring the way emotional and physical intimacy are uniquely intertwined for men, and how that understanding can transform the emotional climate of a marriage. When a man's sexual needs are consistently unmet or ignored in a relationship, it does not simply result in frustration or dissatisfaction. It slowly begins to foster a deeper emotional disconnect, breeding silent resentment, disillusionment, and a sense of emotional abandonment that can quietly erode the foundation of intimacy and partnership. Unlike the popular narrative that positions men's sexual desire as something superficial or easily dismissed, the reality is that sex is often a primary way many men connect, express love, and feel bonded in a committed relationship. When this need is unacknowledged or repeatedly denied without compassion or communication, a man may begin to internalize feelings of inadequacy, rejection, or even shame. Over time, these feelings do not just disappear, they accumulate, gradually building emotional walls between him and his partner. He might stop initiating intimacy, not because the desire has vanished, but because the pain of being turned away has made him emotionally cautious, less willing to be vulnerable, and more inclined to protect himself from further hurt. This withdrawal isn't usually dramatic or confrontational, it's subtle. He may still show up physically in the relationship, still provide, still interact, but emotionally he begins to shut down. This creates a confusing dynamic for both partners. One may see a man who is distant, moody, or disengaged, while the other is quietly nursing feelings of rejection and emotional starvation. The danger lies in the fact that this resentment often grows unnoticed because many men do not have the language or emotional conditioning to voice these internal struggles. They may feel embarrassed to admit that lack of sex makes them feel unloved or unwanted, fearing it will be perceived as weakness, entitlement, or selfishness. So instead of expressing their emotional needs, they suppress them. But that suppressed emotion doesn't dissolve. It simmers, and eventually it shows up in the form of irritability, emotional distance, passive aggressiveness, or even escapist behaviors such as excessive work, digital distractions, or fantasizing about emotional or sexual connection elsewhere. If this pattern continues unaddressed, the relationship can slip into a cycle where emotional and physical intimacy both deteriorate, each partner feeling disconnected and unfulfilled, yet not fully understanding why. The woman may feel pressured or undesired herself, unaware that her partner's emotional disconnection is rooted in long-standing feelings of rejection and unmet emotional needs expressed through sexual longing. And the man may feel unimportant or invisible, believing that the part of himself that wants to connect physically is not only unwanted but invalidated. In this space, misunderstandings multiply, and both partners may begin to feel resentful, not because they don't love each other, but because the emotional and physical feedback loop that once fueled their connection is now broken. What began as a physical need left unfulfilled has become a deeper emotional divide. This is why it's essential for couples to talk openly about sexual needs, not as a demand or obligation, but as an act of emotional care and honesty. When both partners are willing to listen with empathy, to understand that unmet sexual needs are often indicators of unmet emotional needs, they can begin to reconnect not just physically, but emotionally. The truth is, resentment thrives in silence, but it loses power in understanding. When a man feels that his needs are acknowledged, even if they're not always fulfilled in the moment, it builds emotional trust and goodwill. That trust makes him more emotionally available, more patient, and more willing to invest in the relationship in other ways. The goal isn't perfect sexual alignment, it's emotional alignment, where both partners feel safe, desired, and heard. In the end, understanding why men need sex in a relationship is not about catering to ego or fulfilling a physical checklist. It's about recognizing that, for many men, intimacy is a deeply emotional experience that serves as their primary channel for expressing love, vulnerability, and connection. It's how they feel valued, seen, and emotionally safe in a world that rarely encourages them to open up. When this need is acknowledged with empathy rather than judgment, It creates a powerful opportunity for deeper trust, communication, and emotional closeness in marriage. True intimacy isn't just about what happens in the bedroom. It's about understanding the emotional language each partner speaks and meeting each other there with compassion, curiosity, and care. When couples begin to honor the emotional meaning behind a man's desire for sex, they stop seeing it as a problem to solve and start recognizing it as a gateway to greater love, connection, and mutual fulfillment.